There aren't so many really old buildings in Lyme because of a series of fires, the worst of which was in 1844, which destroyed a large part of the town. However, probably because right where we are now, along Bridge Street and Church Street, the houses were sufficiently close to the sea to have some protection in the breeze. So these are among the oldest houses in Lyme, and I think it's very important that we have a good look at them now, because during the process of remodelling, many of the old features are gradually disappearing. Now, just take a look at the amazing panelling in this particular room that we have here. Very old, quartered oak, probably around certainly Stuart time, if not going back to the Elizabethan period. Sounds like you probably know. I'm now standing on steps leading down to the cellar in the Bridge Street fossil shop with Simon Titchener, the owner. And this building, of course, has been largely remodelled, but some of the old effects still remain. And Simon is going to tell us about it.
There's lots of strange things that sort of go on in this shop. We've always put it down to just us being a bit bonkers, perhaps, or imagining things, but according to the previous owner, when the cellar was opened up, there was a small bowl found, an earthenware bowl full of bones, which were, a lot of people have said used to be sacrifices to keep away evil spirits. So instead of throwing it out, we've decided it'd be probably a good idea to keep it and put it in the fireplace in the old bread oven. So that's where it still resides today. But, this part of Lyme is really old, and you always hear sorts of funny goings on with neighbours and things like that. So it's bizarre. It really is.
Well, I think that's it. Thanks.
You got any funny feelings in here?
I'm sitting now in the bar of the Royal Lion Hotel in Lyme Regis, which has a commanding position on the southern end of Broad Street, not far from the sea. It's been a coaching inn since the 16th century and has, during its time, had several different lion names, including White Lion, Golden Lion and Red Lion. However, all this changed in 1856, and that was when the future King Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, arrived and stayed for one night only on the 29th of September. Now, he was here on a walking tour with a servant and his tutor, and it was supposed to be incognito. However, unfortunately, word had got around, and because of the publicity, the palace called him back and they returned the following day. However, the day that he left, the lion, the Red Lion, became the Royal Lion for the first time, which is a name that, of course, it still holds to this day. Of course, there's been many celebrated visitors over the years to the Royal Lion, but one who particularly stands out is the painter James McNeill Whistler, who arrived in 1895 with his wife Beatrice and stayed for a year. Whistler used his time very creatively while he was in Lyme Regis, staying at the Royal Lion. He did two beautiful paintings and many lithographs. The two portraits that he painted, which are now in the Boston Museum of Art, are one, the smith, the master smith of Lyme, which was a portrait of Sam Govia, the blacksmith who had a forge just up on Broad Street and a little way down from where he had his studio. And the other one, which is why we're in this room at the moment, was of a little girl by the name of Rosie Rendell. Now, one day Whistler was sitting in a room like this at the front of the hotel, looking out, and he saw this little 8 or 9-year-old girl playing down below. And he immediately thought, this is really a subject for a portrait. I really want to paint this little girl. And so he rushed outside and went up to the girl and told her that, I would like to paint you. And the little girl, thinking that he meant that he wanted to cover her in paint, ran away, not surprisingly. However, later, after talking with her father and making various arrangements, she was able to sit for him. And out of that sitting came one of his most beautiful portraits, The Little Rose of Lyme Regis. I'm now sitting in the dining room of the Royal Lion, which was, of course, the ballroom at one time. And in this room, many, many splendid events would have occurred. I'm reminded of a tariff card that I saw recently in the museum from the mid-19th century, which had on it, as on offer, it had a ladies' sitting room, a reading room, a smoke room, billiard room, and also a stock room, all for the price of 1 to 2 guineas per night. It particularly interested me to see about the stock room. I mean, I wonder what on earth you would need a stock room. And then, having thought about it for a while, I realized, well, of course, in those days they didn't have luggage carriers with little wheels on them. They would have had large trunks of wood or of metal, which would have taken up quite a lot of space. Because you see, at that time, you would have needed several changes of clothes, because not only would they be staying for longer periods in those days, because of course travel was quite arduous, but also they would have needed socially to have many changes of clothes. To eat here, for example, they would have needed to change for dinner. They would have needed for the balls at the assembly rooms and for other social events in the town, they would have needed a change of clothes. So I'm sure a stock room to keep all their valuables would have been most essential. Now later on, much later, of course, this room was also the headquarters of the Home Guard during the war. And during that period, especially after 1943, the Royal Lion, the bar of the Royal Lion, and indeed of all the other drinking places in town, would have seen many American soldiers. At that time, the 16th Infantry of the US Army was here, waiting to be sent over to Weymouth for the D-Day landings. Unfortunately, the D-Day landings was not such a success for those who were here in Lyme Regis, as they were the ones who were sent to Omaha Beach, which suffered the heaviest casualties of the war. This here is one of the oldest houses in Lyme Regis. According to local historian Richard Fox, it was built in 1580 and would have been owned then by one of the wealthy merchants of Lyme. Lyme at that period, in the Elizabethan era, was a boom town. Today, the Cobb is a famous tourist attraction, made particularly famous by the film The French Lieutenant's Woman, but is of no great commercial significance at this time. However, in 1589, that's a year after the Spanish Armada, Lyme Regis was the third largest port in the country. That's larger than Liverpool and after London and Bristol. At that time, ships from Lyme Regis were sailing to the Mediterranean, to the Americas, to Africa and the Caribbean, bringing back goods to Lyme Regis such as metals, spices, rum and brandy, wines, tea and coffee, and exotic items such as elephant's teeth, ivory and gold dust. Also at that time in Lyme, there were many buccaneering ships and buccaneers who were operating in this area. Sir Walter Raleigh would have been a frequent visitor, for he had trading concessions in the town and was a great friend of Lyme's own Admiral, Sir George Somers. Now if we look here at this marvellous staircase, it's a wonderful example of Elizabethan craftsmanship. It really is a beautiful piece of work. And this staircase is rumoured to be built from timber that was taken from ships wrecked at the time of the Spanish Armada. It's highly likely that Raleigh, Somers and other of the sea captains of that time would have assembled in this very house, perhaps having refreshments with the merchants of the area, to discuss business ventures and also talk about the discoveries of the time. For this is an age when there was an explosion of discovery and adventure. Now, if we look in this room at the beam up there, one can see the marks of the adze, the primitive chisel-like instrument that were used for smoothing down the surfaces of beams at that time. This dates it certainly within the Elizabethan early to mid Jacobean period. Over here we have some panelling, the last remaining bits of original panelling of the house, which date back clearly to Elizabethan or early Jacobean period, as indicated by the pegs. If you can see them just over there on the top bar. We're now in the cellar in a different environment and a different age. Lyme in the 18th century was no longer the great booming city that it had been in the 16th century. At this time, ships had become too big for the Cobb, and the town was in decline. However, smuggling was rife and perhaps the only booming business of the time. And the smugglers were regarded as benefactors to the town because of course they brought in cheap goods. At the time of war, the Napoleonic War, tea, for example, was up to 130% in duty. So it was inevitably a profitable business. And at that time, the revenue officers were disorganized, and also many of them were corrupt, and if not actively engaged in smuggling themselves, were sympathetic towards the smugglers, and often intimidated by the local townsfolk, who very much appreciated the smuggling fraternity. In the 1780s, there was a group of smugglers known as the White Whigs, a gang of some 40 men under the captaincy of an Isaac Gulliver, who operated right outside Cobb Gate, which was where goods from the Cobb were taken to be assessed. Later, after the Napoleonic period, after the Battle of Waterloo, when the customs officials were reorganized and a new customs office created, which was better funded and also better equipped, smuggling became much more perilous. But still, the smugglers were very much supported by the local people, and rich merchants of the time would also have been in cahoots. And places like this cellar would have been the kind of places where goods would have been hidden and stored. It was often a practice of the smuggling fraternity to sink goods below the surface of the sea and collect them at a convenient time. Perhaps the well in this house, in this cellar, was not just used for drawing water, and may also have been a hiding place for contraband goods. Lyme's most famous smuggler, Jack Rattenbury, was born in Lyme Regis, born in Beer rather, but married a Lyme Regis girl. And we learn a lot about smuggling from him because he wrote a memoir in 1837 after he'd retired. And he describes his life as a smuggler as one fraught with difficulty and danger at that time. But even though there were difficulties on the way, still he always managed to find people to bail him out when he was captured and to arrange for his escape. And he describes how one aristocratic gentleman provided him with a pension for life of £1 a week. But smuggling still continued right into the 19th century. In the 1860s, there's records of a notorious smuggler called Abraham Cox. And he had a particularly unique way of recruiting his staff. He would get young men drunk in the Cobb Arms of an evening, who, when they sobered up, would find themselves shanghaied into a smuggling boat out on the open waters. The present owner and past owners have remarked on hollow walls, and construction workers in the road outside have noticed strange passages leading down to the sea from this house and other houses in the area, which must surely have been routes for the smugglers of the period. From this door here is one of the unique features of this house, a priest hole. Now, during the Puritan period and during the Siege of Lyme, Puritanism was of course very popular, and most accepted religious experience in Lyme Regis. However, in 1660, when the King Charles II was invited back to the country, all that changed. The Vicar of Lyme at that time was one Ames Short, and he actually made a long speech welcoming the king back, calling him a moral and godly man. Little did he know how this merry monarch would change. During the period of the next 2 years, a whole raft of legislation was brought in persecuting the Puritans and the dissenters. First of all, they had to abide by the Common Prayer Book of Elizabeth I. And worst of all, they were expected to wear the hated vestments of the old church. This was too much for so many of the Puritans of Lyme. Ames Short himself started the first independent meeting in Lyme Regis and was a constant fugitive. However, he and others like him were protected by many of the influential leaders of the town, including often the mayor, and they were hidden in places like this here, in priest holes which we're about to see. Ames Short managed to stay relatively free, holding services in private houses and out on the cliffs where they could have lookouts in case any intruders were around. But in 1685 rather, the year of the Monmouth Rebellion, he was thrown into the jail in Dorchester. Perhaps this is a place where he, the former Vicar of Lyme, would have been hidden at one time or another, or certainly one of the other Puritans of that period. It is, after all, only a stone's throw away from the church of which he had been the vicar. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege to be in this beautiful house, especially as it is a private residence of Danny Ann Holt and Lindsay West, and is not open to the general public. However, we are now in the beautiful Mermaid Gallery, which is open to the public, which is where Lindsay works, and they also run here a B&B, to which people are of course very welcome.